All right, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our 8th Learn From Home Live. Can't believe that we're already on our 8th session. So my name is Rose. I am the marketing and PR person here at Ocean Sonics. And for those of you who have joined us for our previous sessions, you'll know that we regularly hold these staff learning sessions at our office. And this is where our teammates share their expertise with the rest of our crew. And now, because so many of us, not just Ocean Sonics, are working from home, we wanted to share our learning sessions with you. So we will be doing these live sessions regularly. As I mentioned previously, we are on number 8 now. So keep your eyes on our social media channels. We share all the details such as upcoming topics and sessions on our social feeds. All of our previous sessions have been recorded and you can find them on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. And today's session is also going to be recorded and it will be shared online, so don't worry if you missed something or if you want to watch it again. So today is a little bit different from our normal setup. We actually have 2 experts joining the session today. We have Emma Carline, the Ocean Sonics acoustic algorithm developer, and Jillian Duggan, our staff biologist. Hi, Emma and Jillian. I'm so glad you could join in today.
Hey. Hey.
So for today's topic, we will be discussing SEL and SPL, or sound exposure levels and sound pressure levels. These are common measurements taken during industrial marine activities such as pile driving and blasting. Jillian and Emma will be leading today's session, and it's going to be a back and forth between them. Emma will focus on how to calculate the measurements and when to use them, and Jillian will help us see the importance of them to marine health and how to do the measurements in Lucy, which is the Ocean Sonics data processing software. So before we get started, is there anything that we need to know about underwater noise, SEL, or SPL to help everyone better understand the presentation?
I think we're good. That's what we're going to talk about.
Okay, fantastic. So after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So if you have a question or you want to know some more detail about what we covered today, just leave us a comment in our live stream and we will do our best to answer your question as soon as we're finished. So why don't we take it away?
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen here. Go ahead, Jillian.
Oh, yes. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about understanding measurements used in underwater noise, and we're going to explain why these measurements are used and also how they're used in regulatory requirements and environmental monitoring.
Yeah, so as Rose mentioned, I'm going to explain a bit how to calculate the different metrics, and then Jillian's going to show us how to actually do them using Lucy, and why they're so important. So first of all, why are we measuring underwater sound in the first place? Well, if you have a hydrophone, you probably have already asked yourself this question. But we've divided it up into 2 main kind of categories. We have ocean observation and environmental monitoring. And so ocean observation would be all about discovering, so kind of learning about the underwater environment. So this would include things such as listening to sounds from whales to understand their behavior. I think I'd include geophysical surveys in here. And the other side of this is environmental monitoring, which is it's less discovery and more, what is the effect of the sounds that we're making as humans on the ocean environment. So that would include activities such as measuring noise from underwater construction or drilling, or noise from subsea equipment, like this tidal turbine that's pictured here.
Yes, so we also measure underwater sound because we have increasing noise levels from anthropogenic, so man-made sound, that can negatively impact marine animals in complex ways. And it is important to measure, mitigate, and regulate these sounds that we're putting into the ocean environment to reduce the impact that these may have on marine mammals. So when we're thinking of listening to and measuring this sound underwater, why are we measuring it? So we're measuring it to have a good understanding of what the impact is on the marine mammal. And if we think of it from a human perspective, why do we measure sound underwater? We can kind of think of this quote from the Good Practice Guide for Underwater Noise Measurements, which says, acoustic measurements are required for applications as diverse as acoustical oceanography, sonar, geophysical exploration, underwater communications, and offshore engineering. And more recently, there has been an increased need to make in situ measurements of underwater noise for the assessment of risk to marine mammals. And this is because marine mammals, they need sound to navigate, forage, find mates, and communicate. So this is essentially what they need to thrive. And they need to be able to do these things as well.
Yeah, so before we talk about the actual metrics for sound, we're going to go back and make sure we know what the data is that we're dealing with. So sound is a pressure wave. And so your hydrophone data might look something like this. So we have, it's like an oscillating curve here. And each of the points is a pressure that's recorded by the hydrophone. So you might look at this sound and wonder, there's different pressures here. There's high pressure points, there's low pressure, and some near zero. But what is the overall perceived loudness of this sound? And that leads to the question too, what is the effect of this sound on marine life? So first we'll address the loudness question. So the metric developed to sort of capture the loudness of a sound is called sound pressure level, abbreviated SPL. And so what it measures is an amplitude of the sound. And there's actually different ways of doing this. There's at least 3 types of SPL, and they're all fairly different. So we'll talk about each of these. There's RMS, there's peak, and there's peak to peak. So we're going to take this sample waveform here. It's from actual hydrophone data. I believe it was from sounds measured in a lake. And so this piece that I've taken, it's 0.02 seconds. It starts off fairly quiet, but then there's this pulse at a relatively constant frequency. So what is the loudness of this entire waveform? So first we'll look at SPL RMS, which stands for root mean square. And the title basically explains how you calculate it. So you take the square of the pressures in this wave, and then you take the mean, which is the average, and then finally the square root of that. So it's like a step-by-step process. And so I plotted the RMS level here on top of the curve. So the RMS is about 2 Pascal. And one thing you'll notice is that it's higher than 0, but it's definitely not as high as the highest pressure in the sound. And that's because it's an average. So it's an average over this entire waveform where there are periods of big pressure changes, but also periods where the sound is relatively quiet. And all of the metrics that we're dealing with are sound levels, and that indicates that they're always presented in dB. So don't forget to convert to dB.
Great. The SPL RMS is captured in Lucy, and you can find this when you are streaming wave data or if you're replaying wave data. And you can find this on the top graph under show PK RMS, so peak and RMS. And the first value is the RMS, so root mean squared, and we can see from this plot here that the RMS is actually in green, and it is at 107.7 decibels. And this is captured in Lucy, and it also is shown in this plot right here. And it actually updates based on your update rate of your hydrophone. So it's going to be capturing that as the data moves along. It's going to give you an updated RMS value.
Neat. So times when you might use SPL RMS for measuring sound is for continuous kind of sounds. As you could see in the example before, the RMS was a lot lower than the actual pulse, the pulse peak. So impulsive, short duration sounds can kind of get lost in the RMS measurement because RMS, being an average, it's highly dependent on the time period over which it's calculated. But it reflects very well sounds that are sort of continuous in time, such as drilling, vessel passes would fall into this, many kinds of construction operations. And also sometimes if you get a sound projector, its source level will be presented in SPL RMS to show the loudness of that projector. So next we'll talk about SPL Peak, so a different way of measuring sound pressure level. And it's very simple. It's literally the peak pressure in the signal that you're looking at. So for this waveform here, the peak pressure is it's positive, and it's about 7 Pascal. So we measure from 0 up to the highest, but it's the highest absolute value. So it's possible that it would occur where there's a negative pressure, as long as that's a bit like the most negative pressure. And again, it's going to be represented in dB after you found that value.
Great. And the SPL peak, so SPL 0 to peak, as Emma said, is represented in Lucy by a tanned colored line. So you can find this again in the top graph. Under wave details, show peak RMS, and it is the third one down. So it's saying peak and has 127.1 decibels at that point where I captured this image. And as you could see, Emma was following along that peak, and it usually falls right below the peak to peak values that you'll be able to see in Lucy as well.
Yeah, that's one thing to mention. Peak will be higher than RMS because RMS is an average over time, whereas peak is the maximum. So next, we'll look at the last type of sound pressure level, and that's peak to peak. It's similar to peak, except that it measures the range from the highest positive pressure to the lowest negative pressure. So it's the highest change in pressure during that time period. And yeah, so it's also going to be even higher than peak, of course.
Yes, and here we can see it's the last measurement here, and this says peak to peak, and that is represented in blue, and it will be above your peak and your RMS values. And it's important to note that we were looking at a peak and then a peak to peak, and you may look at it and say, oh, that looks like it's doubled. So why isn't the value doubled when you're looking at the wave details? And that's because when we were looking at pressure, it's almost a doubling in pressure. But when we convert it to dB, it ends up being about 6 dB in the difference. So it usually is around 6 dB higher for a peak-to-peak value compared to the peak.
Yeah. Okay, so when might you use peak or peak-to-peak for measuring sound? So it's best for impulsive sounds because it captures like the worst case scenario. So like the loudest, the highest pressure of the sound. So this would represent well sounds from explosions or air guns, the strike from a pile drive, single ping of an active sonar, or a pulse from a depth sounder, for instance. So these are all short duration, typically loud sounds.
So the effect of the sound on marine animals. As Emma said, these are impulsive sounds that we're usually measuring with the peak and peak-to-peak SPL measurements. And these high peak sound pressures these sounds usually have high peak sound pressures and rapid rise times that can cause increased injuries compared to non-impulsive sounds. So it's important that we actually measure these peak values to determine the risk of sound exposure to marine animals in that area. So it's important that we actually take these measurements so that we can relate it back to any marine animal that could have been exposed if they were in the vicinity of that sound being put into the water. So if we're doing pile driving and we have an area of which we need to monitor for marine mammals, we want to make sure that we know what they're being exposed to.
Okay, so far we've talked about mainly the loudness question, and none of these metrics have actually taken into account the duration of the sound. But this is also, often important. A sound that happens over a long period of time and is not too loud can still have a similar, negative impact as a sound that's in short duration but quite loud. So to address this, another metric was developed called SEL, and that's the sound exposure level. So from the name you can tell it's not just about loudness, it's also about how long something is exposed to this sound. So technically what it's measuring is the energy in a sound. And this is calculated as the integral of the pressure squared over time. So we're going to talk about two types of sound exposure levels. The first one is for single pulses. It's called single strike SEL, and it's often denoted as SEL. So it calculates the energy in a single impulse. So in the example waveform that we have, we would first isolate the pulse in time, and then we would calculate the energy over that time segment. So we would square the pressure and integrate over this time. And again, it's a sound level, so it's always represented in dB.
And this is how we actually take these measurements in Lucy. So when you set up for an impulse detection, you're going to be able to take measurements of every single strike. So these are represented in Lucy by these red lines in the upper graph if you select Show SEL. And it will actually show you the measurement of each single strike exposure level. And it has, in this example, has a sound exposure level of 152.2 for that last impulse. And you can see it in the top left of the screen. There is the impulses that are shown in the spectrogram and the correlating single strikes that are shown in the top graph. And the second screen on the top right shows Lucy with the bottom graph showing a 1/3 octave. So you can also have Lucy show you a 1/3 octave from each of the single strikes. So that will show you where each of the sound pressure levels are the greatest in each band. So you'll be able to see that as well.
But what if the sounds that you're monitoring, happen over a long period of time and there's multiple pulses? You'd also want to know what the total energy is at the end of the day. So that's why there's another type of SEL called cumulative SEL. And so it is actually the sum of energy over all of the pulses that you generate. So there's actually two ways of calculating this. There's sort of a cheap way where you calculate the SEL for one pulse, so the SEL, and then you just multiply by the number of pulses that you made, or pile drives or explosions or whatever, and then convert to dB. The more proper way to do it is to actually detect each of the pulses, calculate the energy in each of them, and then sum that, and then convert to dB.
And this is what Lucy does. So it takes each individual pulse, and it actually is able to add these together to create this cumulative SEL, or SEL cum. And we see this on the top graph as a yellow line. And this yellow line will increase over time as there's an increase in strikes. And you will see on the right-hand side of that there is a cumulative SEL value that will be displayed, and it will update every time there is an additional strike.
Yeah, and so this is always higher than any single strike for sure.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and also, if you're taking the SEL measurements, you might also want to see the peak and RMS values. So those are common measurements that regulatory marine monitoring might need. So we have those as well. So they'll update as the data updates. Okay, great. And then, so we can see these in real time. So we can see it as the data is being recorded and streamed through Lucy. And we can also log these as an impulse detection file. So we log the impulses from the SPL, and we also record a continuous sound exposure level as well as a single strike sound exposure level for each strike. And we do this going into the Lucy settings, and this is where you're going to set up for your individual monitoring. And this is kind of where you have to have some experience, but you can also do this while you're out in the field. You have to find a detection threshold for your environment. And so this is the amount of dB above the ambient noise that it takes to have to record an impulse. So you want to record each impulse, but you also don't want to have an echo or a reflection off of anything in the area recording two impulses. So you might have to change around these settings to make sure that it's the best for your environment and your monitoring situation. So there's a detection threshold. There's also a reset threshold. So this is the amount of dB it has to go down from your higher level to actually reset so that it could detect another pulse. And then you can also set up a pre-detection and post-detection. And this is just the amount of time that Lucy actually takes into consideration when it's doing those sound exposure level measurements. And if you have regulatory requirements that you have to monitor for, you can actually add these in so that Lucy will display if you go over a cumulative sound exposure level that was set, or if you go over a sound pressure level in any individual band. And then finally, you can log this all in a text file that you can open up and review at a later date. And this is just logged anywhere that you'd want to on your computer. You can set up a prefix, and you can also set up the number of records. And just ensure that at the very top, you have enable impulse detection clicked. And then below that, I just have a sample file. So this is half of the text that you would get when you're looking at a sample file. It will show you a time and a number of that impulse. And it will also show you the sound exposure level of that impulse, so the single strike, an SEL cumulative value, an SPL RMS, and a peak value. And then we'll also tell you how long, so the duration in samples that pulse lasted. Yeah, and so we'll do that for every pulse. And it will also give you all of the data for the 1/3 octaves. So it will also show you the sound pressure levels in each band as well. So that's just, that would be to the right of this in the file.
Yeah, so it's super useful that Lucy, and not only, calculate these measurements, but it will detect the pulses for you. And so here's a connection between SEL, cumulative, and the impact on marine mammals. So there's a hypothesis called equal energy hypothesis that states that sounds of equal SEL cum produce an equal risk for hearing loss. So that indicates that, this is the metric we should be using to measure how much impact we're having from the noise we're creating. And so you can see in this table, it's from some well-known research by Southall. It shows the SPL, it's SPL Peak, and single strike SEL that, if you go above these, will cause damage to different marine animals. So for cetaceans with hearing ranges that are high frequency, for SPL Peak, it's 230 dB. For the SEL, it's 198. For pinnipeds, so like seals, it's a bit lower. But yeah, it's just, a concrete example of, why measuring these metrics, so SPL and SEL, is important and is being tried to be directly related to impact on marine life.
And now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the impacts that, why are we taking these measurements? We're going to look at how they may impact marine animals. So underwater noise can interfere with vital life functions of marine mammals, such as navigation, foraging, mating, and communication. And the impacts from the sounds can depend on a number of factors. So as we were saying before, that if there's impulsive sounds, these could actually be more damaging to a marine mammal's ears versus if it's a long, low intensity, it could actually be just as damaging. And we look at these factors such as the sound level, the pressure rise time, the duration, the duty cycle, so how often that sound is happening, and other spectral characteristics. And these all influence how this would impact a marine animal. So if the marine mammal or marine animal was very close to the sound source, it could actually injure them more than if they were further away. And these impacts may include, first off, behavioral changes. And these can be very complex because we don't know what the impact may be of a behavioral change over time. So we can measure usually, the first impacts of or behavioral changes that might occur during a sound that putting into the ocean, so an explosion. And we might see something like fleeing or avoidance of the area, an increased or decreased call rate, or an increased, decreased call level. But we also can see that over time, if there's a constant sound in an environment, that these might start adding up more and more to the marine animals, and they might impact them to a greater degree. And then secondly, there's physiological changes. So the first one being masking, which is interfering noise with the detection or recognition of signals. And so this is when a marine mammal is trying to listen for maybe communication from others in their species, or potentially they're foraging and using navigation clicks, or something like a dolphin trying to look for food. And there's something in the environment that would be that would be overpowering and not allowing them to hear that sound. So it's masking that sound, they can't hear it. And that can be very detrimental if you were looking for food and there was a big ship passing, you couldn't hear your own navigation clicks. That could potentially be you losing out on that food. And then the next one is hearing impairment. So that could be PTS or a TTS. So PTS is an injury that occurs as a permanent threshold shift. So where the sound exposure leads to a permanent damage in a marine mammal's hearing. And this can occur because the marine mammal was exposed to a very loud sound or a sound that occurred over a very long time. And it either impacted its way of hearing, or potentially the sensory cells that are in its ear could be permanently damaged and not able to regenerate. The second one is a temporary threshold shift, and that is temporary damage when the marine mammal is able to regain the hearing after a period of time. So they could be losing out on some vital functions for a short period of time, but they're actually able to regain that hearing in the long term. There's also stress. So these marine mammals could be stressed by the sounds that are actually in their environment, leading to decreased health. And finally, we see injury and death. So these are extreme cases where either fish or marine animals are very close to the encounters of loud sound, and the pressure level actually damages tissues or organs that can actually lead to death. And so next, since we talked about all these impacts that could actually happen, how do we mitigate this, and how do we actually reduce these impacts? And I think the best thing I heard was a quote or read. So it said, reducing sound exposure levels is the most effective available means of reducing actual and potential impacts on both individuals and populations of marine mammals. So this could be reducing sound levels at the source, reducing sound propagation, or avoiding noisy activities at times and in places where sensitive species are present. So this could be anything from potentially using vibratory pile driving instead of impulsive pile driving. We also see bubble curtains, so that would be reducing the sound, so it's not able to travel as far outside of those boundaries that they put up. There's also different types of material that can be used for pile driving that can reduce the sound that it creates. Also, we want to do environmental monitoring before there's actual work done in the area, so that we can see what are these species that are in the area and what could their impacts be. So maybe if there's a migrating species that's coming through, that work isn't done during that time. And also, yes, so this can include also having observers measure the sound exposure levels and inform if they have surpassed sound exposure level limits that are put out by regulators. Also, there's times where you also perform mitigation if there's a marine mammal that comes within a certain distance from your pile driving or your activities that you're doing in the environment.
Yeah, so in conclusion, we've talked about different ways of measuring sound amplitude, and that's through SPL. There's 3 types. We've also talked about measuring sound energy, and that's mainly through SEL, sound exposure level. We talked about how you can do all of this in Lucy. And the importance is really that measuring and understanding sound created by human activities in the ocean, it's essential to make sure that we're not negatively impacting the marine mammals in the area. So just to close, there's references here that you can go back to in the video if you want to check them out. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Let's move right along to some questions. I know that I have plenty for you. So just a reminder, if anybody has some questions about what was presented today, we are monitoring the live feeds right now. So you can just leave it in a comment on either our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page, and we'll do our best to answer your question live. So I'm going to start off with one of my questions. What types of industrial activities typically monitor using SEL and SPL? And is there any legal requirement in Canada that makes people have to use these types of mitigations?
Yeah, okay, so the industrial activities, I think we mentioned a few. I'll mention them again. So pile driving, if they're doing any types of pile driving, they're usually required to do environmental measuring of those sounds, as well as like any explosions or anything that would be creating those loud impulsive sounds in the environment. So if they're doing seismic work and stuff like that. And is there a legal requirement? So usually when people are going to do work in the environment, so in an ocean environment, they would put forward a proposal and they'd have to get a permit to do that job. And usually those regulators are putting out or giving them permission based on guidance from DFO. So they would be giving them those measurements that they have to follow.
Is there any requirement to do preliminary environmental monitoring before any of these activities?
I do believe that most permits are given after there's actually a primary environmental monitoring, but I don't know about all the specifics of like each program.
So we do have a question here from our Facebook stream. Eric would like to know, what do you two think of the NOAA methodology for determining risk to marine mammals?
So I would say that, yeah, so it's definitely, we're getting closer to developing measurements and standards that are based on known data. Right now, we're kind of still in the learning phases of knowing what are these impacts that actually affect the marine mammals and marine animals, so fish and stuff like that. So there's not a lot of, well, or really known studies that have actually tested to try to get a permanent threshold shift in marine mammals, because that's unethical and we don't actually want to do that. So we don't want to like input that sound to them. So we don't actually know those upper limits, but we kind of want to give an all around the best thing that we can do is give these high, like lower level limits, so that we're not surpassing those. I don't know if Emma has anything to add to that.
I'm not super familiar with it, but we did talk about that a bit beforehand. Yeah.
So we spoke today about the different variations of SEL and SPL. Is one more important to measure than the other?
Well, they measure different things. I think usually you should be measuring both, because SEL is measuring like the total energy over like usually a long period of time, whereas SPL is looking at, moment by moment, how loud is this sound, which is also important, as Jillian talked about, how particularly impulsive sounds can be quite damaging to marine mammals' hearing. Yeah, so I think the answer would be both.
Definitely best, I think, to measure both at the same time. So speaking of SPL specifically, when would someone use peak versus peak to peak?
That's a good question. They're quite similar. I think peak corresponds best to loudness, and it's most common, I believe. Mm-hmm. But peak to peak, it's in a way more reliable in terms of measuring it, because usually for hydrophones, there's some kind of DC offset. So like the data that you get back is not centered around zero, and you have to kind of figure out where zero should be. So that might affect your peak measurement, but peak to peak, it doesn't matter where zero is, you'll get the same answer.
So we did use Lucy software for the bulk of this presentation. If someone doesn't have Lucy, can they still perform these measurements? And is there a software that you would recommend or that you know of that can perform similar tasks?
I think that, yeah, so if you're recording all of your wave data, you could definitely use that data in any program that you wanted to use to actually look at the sound and evaluate the sound. I know that there's a lot of software that's actually out there now that you can use to do these measurements. And you could also, put through these measurements in anything like a MATLAB script, or if you are able to actually perform those calculations as well.
So I also have a question about reflections. So you mentioned reflections and dual pulses appearing in data during monitoring. What types of items would one look for in the environment to prevent these types of reflections?
Mm-hmm. I definitely recommend that whenever you're doing environmental monitoring off of any barges or ships or anything like that, that you're getting the hydrophone as far away as possible, because those reflections that can occur, as it bounces off of a barge or it bounces off of the ship, and you're getting two pulses instead of that one pulse that you actually want to pick up and listen to. So having a hydrophone that is actually physically distanced from your ship, and making sure that it's also relatively in the center of the water column is also great for taking these measurements. And just making sure that it's as far away as possible.
So are there any tools? I know you showed how someone can set this up in Lucy, but is there something you can use to simplify the process, such as like an epoch trigger?
I think the best way to do this is with in Lucy would be with the impulse detection, because Lucy is looking for those impulses for you. So that's a fairly easy way to set it up. And also if you have a cable deployment and are able to actually see the stream live, you're able to, adjust those measurements and actually be able to see those detections in the sound that's coming through at that time.
And I think this is an Emma question. Does RMS have any physical significance?
Yeah, it actually does. So if you square RMS, it's proportionate to sound intensity. And so sound intensity is the energy per unit time, per unit area. So where sound exposure is like a total energy, I guess RMS is in a way like energy per time. It's like the average energy in an instant of time.
So I have another question. Typically, how long does a temporary threshold shift last, and what types of activity are more likely to cause TTS?
Yes, so I'm not exactly sure. I can't say that I know the exact time that a temporary threshold shift does last, but I know that it has been measured by audiograms from different marine mammals. So they take a measurement of how well they can hear sound, then they would expose them to a small sound, and then they would also measure that again to see if it decreased or it increased. So they can measure that. I don't know. It would take some time to actually regenerate those so if it was the sensory hairs that were on the nerve ending of the ear, and it would take some time to actually get those like regenerated. Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
What types of activities are more likely to cause TTS?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's definitely dependent on the sound intensity, so how loud the sound is. So if it is a rapid rise time and loud intensity, then that can create those damages. But also, as Emma said, that if it's over a longer period of time, that can also cause temporary threshold shifts. So it kind of just depends. Yeah.
So I have a question about the change long term over time. Introduction of noise into a specific environment over long term permanently alter the behavior of animals, such as like migratory patterns or feeding patterns?
I'm going to say I don't know exactly and I don't know if it is known, just because we're still the scientific community, and like I believe that we're still trying to gain these information, like the information that we would need to actually say for sure that this does impact this in this certain way. So we are continuing to do those studies, and I hope that they do continue in the future, so that we'll have more of this like concrete evidence that there are these behavioral changes that do occur for certain impacts.
Yeah, so I suppose all we can do right now is hypothesize.
Yeah, and we kind of do this based on terrestrial animals as well as humans. So we do know that if we're exposed to really loud sound, that impacts our hearing, and that we can have permanent hearing loss, as well as other terrestrial animals. So we're able to kind of put those, as Emma said, the hypothesis is that these marine mammals would be affected in similar ways, and so that's where we're kind of putting into those.
So speaking of marine mammals, we've talked a lot about them during this presentation. What are the impacts, if any, on fish or other marine species?
Yeah. These are definitely impacted as well. A lot of fish actually do use sound, especially fish with swim bladders. They're more affected by sound and pressure waves. And if this fish is very close to where there's pile driving or impact of different types, that they can actually have tissue damage that's created by this pressure changes. They also can have temporary threshold shifts where they have damage to their ears as well. Usually they have, I think it's predicted that they would not have a permanent threshold shift just because of the amount of nerve cells that they have and that they're able to regenerate them over time. But I wouldn't be able to say if that's like a generalization to all fish, but most fish. They can be impacted. Yeah.
So there's an interesting question that was just posed to us on Facebook, and I don't think any of us can really answer this in a really knowledgeable way, but perhaps we can speculate about what we think the best path forward from our side of the conversation is. But how do we work with Indigenous communities to combine and validate traditional knowledge and observations with our acoustic analysis? I know I can speak about some of the projects that we're doing currently. We're trying to put the tools into the hands of those who are holders of the traditional knowledge and who have been observing these environments for as long as anyone can remember, and allowing them to perform their own analysis to validate their own knowledge. But again, it's all about getting the tools into the correct hands, because we ourselves, we can do the acoustic analysis, and we can collect some of that data, but we ourselves cannot validate knowledge that is not our own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that it's very important to take into consideration and to put more into the knowledge as well, just because over many years, scientists have been going into these environments and thinking that they're the first ones that are going to do measurements, or they're the first one that's actually going to take a measurement of a place, when in fact there's actually traditional knowledge that could be passed on to them and help them make those measurements in those places. And so that's very important for scientists to acknowledge and take into account when they're doing and setting up these experiments and measurements and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, it's very typical for us to live in our silos, especially when we're thinking of the scientific community. We all want to be the first ones, but there's absolutely a wealth of traditional knowledge and information that can really assist in moving science forward. So I'm just double checking, and I think those are all the questions we have for now. Again, thank you so much, Jillian and Emma. And if there is a question that you didn't get to ask, or if there's a topic that you'd like to see covered during our web series, please contact Ocean Sonics via email. Jillian and Emma shared both of theirs at the end of the presentation. And you can always drop us a line on any of our social media channels. And again, if you'd like to revisit this presentation, the video will be available on our YouTube page as well as our Facebook page. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we will see you next week when Dan Hasselman of Force is joining us for an in-depth discussion on acoustic monitoring in the Bay of Fundy. So we hope to see you all then. Thank you so much, everyone.